Are you in the office or out of the office this week? Because the book that I just finished reading this weekend was called Out of Office: The Big Problem and Bigger Promise of Working from Home. It's co-authored by two folks, Charlie Warzel and Helen Petersen, and I'm not entirely unconvinced that one of them, maybe both of them, didn't sit down the moment the lockdowns started to occur in 2020 and began writing this book. It was published in 2021. I think it was actually published in late 2021. I got this through an audiobook format, and listening to it, I think it was narrated by one of the authors, Charlie Warzel, and it was good. It was actually surprisingly deeper than I thought it was going to be. I imagined that this was going to be an easy, breezy read. I thought that it would speak a lot about things that I would just sort of shake my head at and go, yeah, that's true. Yeah, well, duh. And it turns out that it was actually surprisingly deeper than I imagined. And it got me to a point where actually at one point I thought to myself, I need to actually start making some notes about this. And I have a whole host of them that came out of this book. I give it about 3.75 stars on this. If I had to round, I'd say give it a 4. I think that my problem with it is that there's two parts. One is that it does not give you actionable steps about what it is that you're somehow supposed to do with some of the information that it gives you. It's just sort of like, yes, these things are all true. And I guess I don't know. It's sort of like one of those things of like, yeah, the democracy would be better if people were more informed and everyone voted. It's like, yes, it would. And I have no idea what I as an individual am supposed to do in that context. The other part about this that strikes me as a little unusual and why I dinged it off a little bit was only because at the end of this book, they kind of go off the rails a little bit in terms of the direction of this book. And we'll get to that. And so let's start working through what this book is about. First, you'll like this book if you're interested in the history of work, as I am. I actually noticed this book because an author that I really enjoy, Cal Newport, who has written a few books, one of the first of which on this topic of the history and culture of work and management and office culture, was a book called Deep Work. And it's a book that I have given 5 stars to. It's one of the few books that I've read twice. I recommend it to people. I gift it to people because it scratches at the core of something that people don't have a name for. They can sense it and they can feel it. But they don't have a name for it. And Cal Newport, I think, was really good at giving this a name called Deep Work. And not to get too far off the track of what Out of Office is about, but Deep Work talks about how technology has sort of fried everyone's minds about through Slack and email, and that you probably could not, if you tried, develop a more frustrating and irritating and cumbersome mechanism to annoy people than the combination of Slack and email. And I think that Out of Office sort of picks up and carries forward where Deep Work leaves off. And Cal Newport blurbed the back of this book Out of Office. And I think that the description of it here, I don't know that the description of this really does itself much good, but I'll read it to you and you can decide for yourself. It's a future-looking, game-changing book about the radical transformational potential of working from home. If you think working from home during the if you think you're working from home during the pandemic, Charlie Warzel and Helen Petersen are here to tell you otherwise. What we're doing right now is something else, a jury-rigged compromise made under the duress of a national crisis that's satisfactory for neither the worker nor the employer. But they also see that the past few months have revealed that there may be another way to go to work on a more permanent basis, one that doesn't involve hellish daily commutes and the demands of jam-packed work schedules that no longer make sense for our time. As a society, we have talked for decades about flexible work arrangements, and as the authors make clear, we may finally be at an inflection point where this becomes possible for almost everyone. Out of Office combines groundbreaking reporting and the couple's first-person experiences after they made the decision to leave their desk jobs in New York City for Montana. They describe how workers and employers across America and around the world are finding new ways of working that make people happier and more productive, and companies more profitable. This is a book that aims to reshape our entire relationship to the office and outline a path towards a new kind of work-life balance that can improve our lives and strengthen our communities. Now, two things I want to touch on real fast here. You might be thinking that this is not a book for you if you are either not a manager, maybe you don't really work in an office environment, or that your work from home is somehow different than other people. Like if you have always worked from home and this is just sort of how you've always done it, you may also be thinking that this might not be that interesting of a book because you don't have a culture or sort of a process that you can change in any reasonable fashion. And that's a lot of people. But I actually thought this book was far more in depth about how we got here. And to start things off, let's talk a little bit about flexibility and autonomy. Flexibility and autonomy were some of the building blocks that Cal Newport started to lay in Deep Work, where he mentions that most people, most of the time, don't really want necessarily more money or more, more days off or better benefits or these sorts of things. What they actually seek and control the most is flexibility and autonomy. And that if you're a manager and you can figure out a way to give your employees more flexibility and autonomy, they will be happier workers as a result. For a lot of people, we've started to see this shift over the years. As the authors note, this shift has been around for decades. It's just been very unevenly applied. It's for things like maybe newborns have impacted a worker's schedule, and maybe mom or dad need to shift their work schedule a little bit so that way they come in later or they come in earlier and they leave earlier or later, or whatever their situation might be. Those sorts of things are the big obvious ones that we've seen for a good long while. They're not new or surprising to a lot of people, but I think we're starting to see an inflection, and the authors don't go into this much, but I think we're starting to see a little bit of an inflection on work around people's known realities, right? And so in my case, I work better in the mornings. You probably don't really want me around doing a lot of heavy, difficult, challenging work in the afternoon because it's just not going to be good, and I'm probably going to have to redo it, or I'm not going to like it, or I'm just going to spin my wheels. And so in those circumstances, if you can figure out that this person's a night owl and this person's a morning person, and sort of allow them to flex, maybe instead of a 9 to 5, it's a 7 to 3, or it's a 10 to 6 situation where they can sort of be in their zone a little bit more comfortably. And that those circumstances can be possible if, and this is on the second part of what they talk about in the books, our meetings and office culture could get itself into shape. That generally speaking, people have far too many meetings. People are burned out on these things. And as the authors note, most of what our in-person work was like at the time of the pandemic under national duress, we all just sort of picked it up and plopped it into a digital universe. This was totally expected. It would have been no other way, quite frankly. This is how history has always repeated itself with new mediums and channels and formats for basically anything. As one example, if you imagine that we have performed plays in the theater, and then we suddenly have radio, then the first radio shows were usually just plays with the audio. And the same actually came true with television. That television was itself just plays enacted on camera. And in those circumstances, those mediums didn't have a chance to sort of develop into their own sense of themselves without some time, right? It took time and creativity for people to sort of understand the limitations and the options available to them in those formats. I think the same thing's happening in relationship to our office, and sort of reorienting ourselves around all sorts of made up things that we can continue to just make up. For example, we made up the idea of a 5-day work week. We can change that, right? Cal Newport talks sometimes about how people can have a second secret part-time job, that if you're working from home, as most people probably are aware, a lot of jobs don't require a full 37 and a half or 40 hours a week, or whatever your shift might be, particularly for white-collar knowledge work. You probably only need maybe a fraction of that. Maybe 25% of that can be freed up because you can actually complete the work early enough in the day or early enough in the week that you sort of have some time left to yourself that you can then do for other things. Like maybe you take a walk or spend time with the kids, or maybe you pursue other pursuits like writing a book or, studying a new hobby or something. And so we can reorient ourselves around these things and create sort of a new understanding about how it is that we all work. And the authors argue that we should be creating our own individual measure of meetings and tasks and the kind of work that we do. This is for freelancers pretty obvious and simplistic. It's time tracking. And as I was reading or listening to the book, rather, I kind of had the idea. It's like, I generally track the things that I do for clients for billing purposes. That's not unusual for a lot of people. And you can imagine sort of how that works. But I should start tracking wasted time. Like I should sort of have a toggle timer running that runs in the corner of my desktop that I can hit when I recognize that I'm just sort of goofing off. And I'm not saying that I do this all day, like on a weekend or something, but if it's a Tuesday and I start looking into a news story or I go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole for some reason, I should somehow track that time. And maybe I can find some interesting ways to identify how that time gets used at the end of the month. But I haven't done that, but it was an idea that came to mind that I wrote down. Overall, we should at least have an understanding of how to process our time and work. Because as the authors note, work from home is a skill. And so the first section of this book that they go into is about culture. And this starts talking a little bit about the history of work and how we got here. And they talk about how we build a culture of respect, or we should be building a culture of respect for each other with guardrails for scheduling, email, time off, and the expectations of what it is that we are doing in our work. Cal Newport says in his books, So Many Words, which again is sort of, picking up where this left off, it's having an understanding of how asynchronous work should work. And asynchronous work is the sort of thing that a lot of companies are sort of doing this. If you use a service like a Teamwork or Asana or Trello even, or if you have some sort of shared project management tool, if you find yourself taking things out of that project management tool and then pushing them into Slack or email, you've gone from an asynchronous into synchronous. And if those words don't make a lot of sense to you, imagine it this way. If you imagine what it was like when you were taking classes, perhaps in college or maybe even in school, in high school, if you're young enough, if you are taking a class that is happening at the same time as other people are sort of physically, quote, in a room, a digital room of sorts, that's a synchronous class that you are all synced together. There's an instructor who's presenting, and you are absorbing that information and interacting in that environment at that time. That's a synchronous event. An asynchronous class or an asynchronous event is one that's happening on your own time. So this podcast that you're listening to, for example, I'm recording this at about 6 o'clock on January the 3rd, and you're listening to it at some point, not January 3rd at 6 o'clock, right? And so that's an asynchronous event. And if we sort of build a culture around each other and each other's schedules and time, and recognizing that I can't just pop into this person's office, or I can't just pop into their Slack, I can't just pop into their email, I can't just drop them this quick phone call because it just isn't that important. And that's the trick, right? Like you have to recognize like, this thing that I need just is not all that important. And so it can wait. And it'll be better for everybody if I just don't disturb that person. It'd be like if you went to the doctor's office and you just barged into whatever room the doctor was in and you were like, hey, I have this problem, come here and deal with it. Like that would be incredibly annoying and rude. I think it would be rude for the patient, but if you think about this from a client or business management perspective, it's actually rude for the people that you're working for, because there's a lot of residue that gets stuck in the back of your mind when you have to sort of task shift like that. And so the authors talk about how that some companies are just in a low wage, low value kind of work where you can't easily enhance your company culture. You can't put these things into place. And so there are obvious situations where you can tell it's like, well, if you're working the checkout aisle at the Gap, then yeah, you're probably in sort of that work where you really can't enhance your company culture very much. But for a lot of people who are in small teams, or if you're in a middle management or a management position, that you can sort of drive at least a small portion of your day around these guardrails. And it's mostly things like, don't bother people except during established office hours, like maybe 11 to 1 o'clock is the time that you know that you can sort of pop into people's Slack threads or whatever. If at all, when possible, stick to your project management tool and keep all records of everything in that. And making sure that you allow people to have some time off, but you set some expectations about what it is that their job entails. And so some companies that are in these low wage, low value kinds of work environments, you're going to have a hard time making some accessibility accommodations for those people. The authors actually note literal accessibility accommodations in the office, or giving people time off as part of their benefits for things. And so things like if you're a wheelchair user, that they might, it's not unheard of that a person who interviews in a job for someplace and they're in a wheelchair, that the employer may look at them and think, this is going to be expensive because I'm going to have to buy them a special desk, or I'm going to have to buy them a special chair, or I'm going to have to put in these ramps all over the place or whatever, or we don't even have a compliant bathroom, or any of these number of other things, right? Research suggests that most of the time the cost of the employer in those circumstances, according to the authors, is only about $500, and that the benefits far outweigh that, because those people have they have experiences and certain viewpoints about things that actually can improve services. So if you imagine, like, if you're in a technology job and a person's got mobility issues, their ability to interact with software, for example, can be a benefit to the team because they bring a different sort of perspective about how that software should work, as one example. The authors go on to talk a lot about Taylorism and capitalism and sort of making work in our lives. And they talk about, this is where they sort of get into the history of things. And the history of work being generally, we spent most of our time making our food, and that most people involved in the economy were involved in making our food. And then we sort of had this industrial revolution where we had this switch to factory work. And suddenly, after factory work, things started to shift. And it was where making work auxiliary to our lives started to shift, and where people went into a workplace, capitalism in factories was very similar to prisons, that people would come in. There was a established set of guidelines about, you come in at this bell and then you sit in this spot, and then, we're going to work to eliminate superfluous moves, and we're going to put this rigid order to dehumanize all of you and make you into just sort of units of manufacturing. And in that process, we enter the middle manager, right? Because now you have all these people who've come in, they were working in the fields all day, now they're working in the factories. They are just sort of treated as human bionic widgets that are assembling pieces of things or moving pieces of things around. And in order to manage all of that, you needed the middle manager. And from the middle manager on, from that point, you start to get larger and larger companies that start to form corporations. And corporations offer stability and a sense of belonging and community. Now, there are some downsides to this, obviously, but there are obviously some upsides to this, because that is true. That in the time of, the 1950s or so, right after World War II, corporations offered all of those things. They offered stability, they offered a sense of belonging, and they offered a community for white men, of course. But within those circumstances, they actually started to develop the idea of the suburb, and the suburb was sort of this like Disneyland for boring white men, because it had things like golf courses and country clubs, and it had the sort of schools that they all, wanted to make use of, and it had all the kinds of trappings and services that was advantageous and useful for the company man. And the company man and his company man wife were also beneficial to the corporation, because they could host dinners, and the wife could cook for the clients or whatever. And this was all sort of pushed around in a way that was beneficial to everyone. But aside from the fact that it sounds awful in so many words, it sounds pretty terrible, but it's also, it does provide a sense of belonging and community for a segment of the population. And then we start to get to a point where you recognize that individuality and challenging the status quo, challenging that sense of stability or the sort of company culture, was tantamount to career suicide. And this starts to get us into the point of about the 60s and the 70s, where we recognize that company culture is often a stilted way of coercive storytelling. It's a half lie built to encourage a half truth. And in this notion of a company culture, it's things like, we hear them today, even like the remnants of this, which is that we're a family, or we're a team together, and that we all have each other's backs, or we offer these sorts of things that nobody else does, or we offer it in this sort of way that nobody else does. And IBM is a good example of a company culture that people are pretty familiar with versus, say, an Apple or a Microsoft, right? But in this process of the 80s and the late 70s and early 80s, we started to see some downturns in the economy. And so what initially was a stable sense of belonging and community in a corporation wasn't so stable anymore. And by the 80s and 90s, corporations learned from their massive layoff events in the 70s that you never undergo massive downsizing, because when you undergo massive downsizing, everything goes to hell, right? Like, the people get mad, you get bad press, and that nobody likes any of that. And it's just bad for all people involved at all levels of government, the public, and the media, and press relations, and customers, and clients, and employees. And so it seems around the 80s and 90s, according to the author, that there was more likely a time then that we were going to reinvent company culture as opposed to undergo a massive downsizing for things. And part of what that did, in order to avoid bad press and massive layoffs, was that many companies decided to trade people's benefits and that family feeling that they had with autonomy in the form of more control and freedom over their work life. And this is where we get to independent contractors. And at this point, in the 80s and 90s, we start to see this class of worker that enjoys that level of autonomy and control, but they also enjoy it because they recognize that they're not really missing out on that much, because the companies were also downsizing benefits and other perks of working in an office, such in a way that that company culture that we think of from our grandparents' era just wasn't there anymore. And personally, I wondered if at one point they talk about how company culture was designed around silly things like pep rallies and all the crap that we used to do in high school. And companies still do these sorts of things today. We're all familiar with the office retirement party and the office birthday parties, and passing the birthday card around and signing your name on it for the person that you've never met or never talked to or whatever. And they mentioned that Caterpillar, the machinery company, dressed up all their machines as costumes, and they would gallivant around the office with bag cake and cold, stale, fizzy water. And I wondered if this wasn't something of a reaction from older generations who found those things to be a lot more interesting. And so I can recall working with older workers years ago who seemed to just be genuinely impressed by a lot of things, right? They seem to like the idea of these little company outings and things. They like to go to the happy hours, and they like to go to the birthday parties and these events around the office with other people. And part of me wonders, as I was reading this, that maybe a younger generation of people have come along now with technology and games and entertainment that's just so much more glitzy in their wow factor. And companies just really haven't figured out a way to up their game on these sort of crummy office parties. That if you want people to have a good time, that you should, instead of getting some bad grocery store cake or whatever, making everyone sit under bland fluorescent lights, that maybe you're going to have to figure out something else. The authors don't really talk about that so much. It was just an idea that I had in my mind as I was reading it. But it made me feel like part of the issue is that some employees today most likely feel like their employer is cheap as a result of this, right? Whereas in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, yeah, you could have yourself a little office party with some bag cake and some stale fizzy water, and everyone would be like, this is great and fun, and we all had a grand old time or whatever. But today, that is just cheap, right? It is just not working. And as we started to think about this, we start to think about more modern companies, right? And the authors start going into things about like startup culture. And I thought too that startup culture was almost akin to recruiting orphans as spies, right? Like this is like James Bond being an orphan makes for a great spy because he has no family to go back to. Startup culture does the exact same thing where they're always looking for hungry 20-somethings that can sort of work at all hours and spend the night in the office and live in this culture that Silicon Valley has sort of weaved together that's starting to bleed over into other ways that other people work in the rest of the country and other sectors of the economy. And there's a moment where I was reading this portion and I thought this whole book is about breaking the cynical rigidity of how we work. And they start talking a little bit about middle management again. And I had made the remark to myself that management is a bit like everyone's unprepared for it, right? Like they talk about this too, is that most management is like the teacher who gets paid a little bit more to coach volleyball, but he really has no experience, or she has no experience coaching volleyball. It's just that they were here and they were sort of interested in it. And so they end up getting the job and they get, paid an extra $500 or whatever. Or in the case of a middle manager, they might, get a bump of $5,000 or $10,000 a year. And suddenly they're in a position where they're not really equipped to be doing much in that position. It's a bit like the Peter Principle. The authors did not talk about this. This was based off of another book that was written, I think, actually in the 60s. Maybe it was the 80s. By the same name, called The Peter Principle, that in so many words suggests that everyone always rises to their maximum level of incompetence. And the example there being, imagine that you're a teacher and that you're a really good teacher and everyone's like, wow, this teacher is really great. We like you. We think you should be a principal. And so you're like, oh, okay. And you take the position of being a principal at the school and everyone's like, hey, you're a great principal because, the kids like you and the staff likes you. And it seems like you've been able to really work with parents and some things. And so, you've been great at this. We think that you should now be the superintendent. But see, as you go from teacher to principal, you can see the relationship between those things in terms of interacting with students, but you're not educating anymore. And so the thing that you were really good at in some circumstances as a teacher, you don't do anymore. So then you go to the principal and then you have some of that interaction, but then you move on to a superintendent, and that's a whole different ballgame, right? Because now you have to interact with politicians and school board and more parents in the community, and you have to work with other administrators, and you hardly ever interact with any of the teachers who liked you before, and you don't interact with the students at all. And in that circumstance, you have risen into this high level because everyone liked you and thought you were good at the things that you were doing, but now you're in a position that you don't do any of the things that you were ever good at. And so you have risen to your level of incompetence. And there's a lot in this book about how I think that management is a little bit like where they rise to their level of incompetence without a whole lot of training. And there's a line in here too where they talk about amid company culture still and bad managers and Silicon Valley culture that's sort of leaking into everything, that we can't ping pong table our way out of this. And that we all need to create cultures that allow people to thrive. And they talk about how the monoculture of white men in corporations allowed corporations and white men in the 50s and 60s to thrive in that culture. And that we should really be figuring out ways to do this today. And some of that includes things like diversity training, as the authors mentioned, where they say that even though the results of diversity training is often worse because the whole thing becomes a module to complete and not anything that necessarily changes a culture, but that we should make an effort to understand what we are doing and why we are doing it. And so the example that they give in relation to diversity training is that instead of doing sort of a race collection sort of thing where it's like, well, we have all these white people on this board, we need to get a black person on here or whatever, which is very superficial and doesn't necessarily add a whole lot. Think of other factors such as, do you have gay and straight parents? Do you have diversity of generations? Do you have diversity of people that have disabilities or not? Single and couples, Ivy League school graduates and not, and so forth like that. And how do you shift the locus of control and power dynamics in your workplace and on your leadership teams and committees and boards and so forth that includes those different groups. And the reason why they mentioned this was thinking about office happy hours, right? And thinking about how office culture so often has these after work happy hours that assumes quite a lot. It assumes that you like alcohol, and it assumes that you have no kids or a dog, and that you handle small talk well, right? Like if you've been at the office all day, then suddenly you have to assume that there is no child or dog that is relying on you to come take care of them, and that you like alcohol, and that you actually want to do that. And if you had a diversity of people in a culture, you will be able to sort of see your way through those things and recognize that that's a thing that we can do, that some people can do, but probably shouldn't be a thing that everyone is expected to do. And they also go forth, and the last part of this culture section was about treating work like a family. And they say that treating your work like a family is an assault of familial obligations and are likely to make you suffer through less pay for more hours. And it's from a bygone era of business, and like family farms as some sort of ideal situation where we think about, yes, we're all in this together. The reality is that they're just as hierarchical and patriarchal and exploitive. And so when somebody says that, we're here to work as a family, you should run the other direction, because that is just not the case. The other section that's in this book, the second section rather, is about technologies. And this section is a bit off to me. There's a lot of discussion about the history of emails and paperless offices, and it goes on to talk about some examples like Chiat Day, one of the advertising agencies that went to this extreme, I think in the 90s, I think it was the 90s. They went to this extreme of a paperless office, and suddenly people were storing paperwork in the trunks of their cars because they just didn't have any place for it, and they needed some place for it. And I get that. But like I have said in other books, when you start comparing yourself to organizations that are so widely known and recognizable in a sector or industry, you've lost me, right? Like you can't compare most people at any point in time to the internals of really anything, Microsoft or the Gates Foundation or Apple, and it just doesn't work, right? It's just not it's like a company privilege that you can sort of work in some of those places. Most people, most of the time, just aren't working in offices like that. They're working in, call centers for insurance companies or something. And so the book goes on to talk about how offices should be rebuilt from the ground up, and they focus on Twitter as another example here. And again, I look at this and I'm like, oh man, freaking Twitter. Like this is another company that is not an exemplar of sort of middle America values on how companies operate, but there they go talking about Twitter. And they were talking about how in the aftermath of COVID-19 and bringing their employees back, Twitter has actually started to remove things that have lulled people into the office, like food service. So again, if you're at a company that can feed you all the time for no cost, I guess good for you. But they wanted to sort of switch into a more remote environment with what is increasingly being called hot desks, where you just have an office space and people come in as they need to and plop down at a desk or two or a conference room, and then most of the time everyone leaves and works from wherever it is that they work. But if you have things like food service that sort of lull people into the office, well, you don't really get away from that so much, and it doesn't seem fair to the people who you've hired that are truly remote. Like if they're off in a whole other state, for example, those people are never going to come in for a sandwich. And so making sure that there's equality there is one of the ways that they cite, and is an example of transitioning from a full-time in-person office to a full-time remote office. Another example that they did give that I thought was pretty good, this again from Twitter, that is applicable to everyone, is that they made a rule that if you're in a conference and everyone's in a conference room, everyone in the conference room has to have a laptop open so that the virtual attendees can see everyone just as well. I think I get the intent of that. My concern with that is that the idea of having a bunch of people in an office with laptops open in front of them seems like a mess for distraction and disaster. That's a topic for another day, and that's a topic for deep work. So there's my callback to that. Again, they go back and they say that we should be embracing asynchronous work, which has the benefit of leaving lots of documented processes and notes. We talked about at the beginning of the show here, where we talked a little bit about if you're working in a team project management system like Asana or Trello or Teamwork or whatever, that every time that you take something out of that system and you just sort of hive mind your way, you just sort of haphazardly just shoot questions, boom, 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 between people, that that synchronous work is then no longer documented. And so if you embrace asynchronous work, you actually have the benefit of documenting lots of processes and notes about what it is that people are doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, what's wrong, what works well, and what clients like or what customers need, or these sorts of things. And so that's a high point there that I think that more people should think about as part of the value of asynchronous work. And they don't devote a whole lot of time and attention to that in the book. I get why, because it's not a very sexy topic and it's a little nerdy, and it is what it is, right? You should document what you're doing, and people should spend more time thinking about what they're doing as they're doing it and writing that stuff down. But they didn't devote that much time to it. So they go on to say that a little bit about surveillance tools, and saying that surveillance tools are coming for all of us, really, and that we should be very wary of them. They did make one critical observation here. Surveillance tools in the workplace make work more quantifiable, even when a lot of jobs aren't highly quantifiable. It's things like, there's always been the sort of metrics of like how many customers did you help today, or how many tickets did you close, and these sorts of things. But if you're in a situation where it's like, well, I don't do that. I write, legal briefs, or I review documents, or I edit things, or I design stuff, or I make web pages or something, that a lot of this surveillance stuff can start to quantify what it is that you're doing in more nuanced, aggregate ways than you probably ever thought that you could. And so that stuff's probably all coming for a lot of people, whether we want to or not. But for knowledge workers, this is bad news. I think it's bad news. And they make the point in the book that it's a failure of companies to recognize trust between the employees and the employer. And that in a work from home environment, when you introduce a lot of surveillance, either on the phones, or you give somebody a company cell phone and it's like their primary cell phone device, or if they have like the one computer in the house and it's the work computer, or you make them install software on their own personal work computers, as is often the case for contractors and part-timers and freelancers and things, that this is the last flimsy barrier to corporate monitoring and marketing inside our homes. And that's not cool. The third and final thing that they discuss in the book was a section on community. And this is really where I think this book kind of goes off the rails a little bit sideways. I get what they were talking about and why they were talking about this. They cite the book Bowling Alone. And Bowling Alone was originally published, I think, back in the 70s or 80s. And the book became sort of a cult classic. It was very lengthy, too. I'm looking up the name of the author here for it. This was Robert D. Putnam. And there was a revised version that I think was published in 2000 or so. And the premise of the book is, when you think about what's undermined American society, what has done the most harm to Americans, it's someone's got an answer, right? First it's social media, and before that it was the internet, before that it was video games, before that it was television, and before that it was radio, and there was comic books in there at one point, and people at one point thought that electricity was, all these different things were just sort of the beginning of the end of American civilization. In Bowling Alone, the author makes the point that probably what it was that has sort of undermined American society the most is the loss of community organizations and groups. And in this case, he was citing bowling leagues as an example as a bellwether thing that people did, mostly men again, that allow people some connection. The authors in Out of Office take the same approach and talk about the loss of civic organizations like the Junior League and Rotary and the Lions Club and the Odd Fellows. And they rattle off a list of more than probably 24 different groups that just aren't that strong today, and including churches in a lot of circumstances too. And they go on to say that the failure of these organizations isn't necessarily their fault. It's that work has consumed our identities, and we have developed this inward obsession at the expense of everything else in our lives about how to care for or gather outside the realms of our jobs. That by and large, that with the exception of maybe a brief vacation for a week or something a year, if that most people just don't meet other people outside of their jobs or outside the context of their jobs. It's like, hey, we're at work, let's get lunch. Hey, we're at work, let's get dinner. Hey, we're at work, what are you doing on Saturday night? We're going to host this office Christmas party or whatever. These sorts of things have sort of consumed our identities. And this gets back to the notion that our lives and our work should be more separate. They should be more separate the way that they were sort of at the height of the Industrial Revolution, that even though people were cogs in literal machines, when the cogs were done turning for the day, or at least when their shift was done turning, they went home, right? And they had a life and they did something else. And there have been other problems over the years with these sorts of things as people have sort of grappled with, like, now that I have all this time, what do I do with it? But, again, they argue that there should be more guardrails on our work that allow us to do more things that fulfill us. I thought about this personally, and I was like, what would I do that would fulfill me more? And I don't know that I have an answer to that. I don't know. Maybe my life is more perfect than I think that it is in some circumstances. If so, I guess it's lucky for me. But I think I've certainly felt over the years the same longing for community and getting with other people in ways that aren't related to work. And I miss that. I don't have a lot of that in my life. I think most people probably don't have a lot of that in their life. And the authors seem to argue that we should just plain work less. And I don't think that's a bad argument. I just don't know how we're supposed to get there. And that's where a lot of the arguments in this book start to float off the rails a little bit, because they just don't have very good guardrails about how to implement these things. It's sort of like, again, wouldn't it be great if everyone was more informed about who they were voting for? Yes, it would. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I have no idea what we're supposed to do to fix it. I suppose they did their part by writing a book about it. Maybe they'll start a movement and we'll have some sort of culture shift. The hope here, I think, is that COVID-19 and this pandemic will shift people's emotions and the sort of the cultural attitude and mores about these things. And that it will also shift the way that we think about and design our lives and the way that we live. When I say it goes off the rails, I mean it literally goes off the rails and onto some literal rails, because they start talking about how our cities are developed and that transit and transportation networks in cities need to adapt and be, they need to morph with the needs of people as this pandemic moves. And if we are moving in this scenario of a more remote work life, that having transit networks and roads and highways that all lead to a central business district don't make a whole lot of sense anymore, which is true. If people are going to spend more time in their homes, which are sort of usually built around those central business districts, that we need more things like crosstown routes and more roads that fit within more regionally defined grid networks, for example. And those things are all fine. I think that the conservative readers in the bunch that will read this book will probably throw the book against the wall at this point, because they start talking about how we should just plain pay more taxes. I think this is a little bit of their New York attitude. Actually, I didn't realize it until after the end of the book that they were originally from New York. They talk about how they moved to Minnesota, but I could just sort of tell, it's like, these people must be living in New York. They seem to have access to lots of things that the rest of us just would never think about in our day-to-day experience in cities, right? Particularly in rural areas. They also talk about how unions and childcare should be things that employers start to provide, or at least maybe the government should start to provide, so that way we can allow people to have that sense of mobility and equality across more than just white knowledge workers, that more people can sort of experience their cities and experience the culture around them, and also experience different kinds of work. So it was sort of a very weak ending. I get what they were getting at. I feel like they were just sort of grasping at like, what do we do to fix these problems? And there is no answer to it. And so they just sort of came with this wish list of like, well, we should just do all this stuff. And it's like, well, this is like a 50-year roadmap here. And so I appreciate and I respect your gravitas in thinking about that. I don't think they're wrong about some of that. I don't think that it's a bad idea that we should be thinking about how our cities are designed and how we get around and how we move and sort of how our communities are established between all of us, and that civic organizations have a place and that I wish they were stronger and I wish that people could partake in them. I, for my part, used to be a member of Kiwanis and the Rotary Club, and I did both of them for a year, two distinct runs, 2 distinct years in the lead up before the pandemic. And I realized that the reason why I can never go, it's like, well, it's because you have meetings at 11 o'clock on a Thursday, and I can't ever get out of work. I can't ever swing that level of commitment because it would require me to take a bus for about 20 minutes, go to this event for an hour and a half, and then take a bus back. And that's like 2.5, 3 hours, right? And that's a big chunk of a Thursday. And the authors aren't wrong when they say that we should just plain work less. I just don't know how some people are supposed to be able to accomplish that. Good goals, though. I gave this book a 3.75. I think that if they had a little bit stronger of an ending, they could have had a 4. I think you'll like this book if you're interested in the history of work, urban planning, technology, and just the hard truths about focusing on our lives and not just our work. It's a good book. I appreciate that they got it out as quickly as they did, and worth at least skimming through because it's a pretty breezy read. You can probably finish it in about 4 hours.